Most fossils are basically receipts, bones, shells, just enough to prove something existed. But every once in a while, the universe hits save as 4K. Entire dinosaurs with skin and armour still in place. Four-winged predators with their last meal still in their stomach. Baby mammoths with eyelashes. Even ancient dino chicks, curled up inside eggs like they're about to hatch tomorrow. In this video, we're looking at 16 prehistoric fossils so insanely well preserved they don't just show us what lived back then. They show us fur, feathers, colours, behaviour, and even the exact moment some of these creatures died. Burgess Shale, a Cambrian ecosystem frozen in place. If you could scuba dive into time instead of water, one of the craziest places you could visit would be the Burgess Shale. It's high in the Canadian Rockies today, but about 508 million years ago, it was the floor of a deep, quiet sea. What makes it legendary isn't just the number of fossils, but how insanely complete they are. This isn't, here's a random shell. This is, here's the whole animal, soft parts and all. Like someone pressed an entire ecosystem into a scanner. Most fossil sites only preserve hard things, shells, bones, teeth. The Burgess Shale went, nah, we're keeping everything. Worms, jelly-like blobs, soft-bodied predators, even guts and eyeballs made it into the rock. Animals like Hallucigenia with spines and tentacles, Opabinia with 5 eyes and a grabber trunk, and early arthropods like Waptia and Morella are flattened but still detailed enough that you can trace their limbs, gills, and sometimes even digestive tracts. It's like opening a 500 million-year-old PNG file and zooming in without it pixelating. The location itself is weirdly dramatic. The fossils sit on the side of a mountain in Yoho National Park, British Columbia. Back in 1909, Charles Doolittle Walcott, a paleontologist with a ridiculously fancy name, found strange impressions in slate up there. At first he thought they were just odd crustaceans and worms. As he kept splitting rocks, the sheer diversity and detail hit him. He had basically stumbled onto the first clear group photo of complex animal life on Earth. The key to that preservation is a kind of underwater disaster that turned into a miracle. Picture a steep submarine slope near a reef or underwater cliff. Now imagine mud and fine sediment suddenly sliding down in a rapid, dense flow, burying whatever lives in the basin below in a thick blanket. These mud avalanches smothered entire communities in a low oxygen environment where scavengers and bacteria struggled to break everything down. Over time, the bodies flattened and turned into dark films of carbon in the shale, but the outline stayed ridiculously crisp. Because of that, the Burgess Shale doesn't just show what animals existed, it shows what they were doing. Some fossils are found lying in groups, suggesting herds or aggregations. Others are preserved mid-molt or mid-burrow. You can see predators with their prey in their guts. It's not just a bestiary, it's a snapshot of behaviour. For early animals that lived so long ago, the continents were unrecognisable. That level of detail is almost unfair. It also completely messed with early 20th century biology. Before the Burgess Shale, people expected early animals to look like proto-versions of things we have now. Simple shells, simple worms, nothing too wild. The Burgess fauna said otherwise. Many of its residents don't fit cleanly into modern groups. Some, like early arthropods and primitive chordates, clearly sit near the roots of today's major phyla. Others look like full-on failed experiments, entire body plans that appeared during the Cambrian explosion and then vanished. That's part of why this site is so important. It captures the Cambrian explosion mid-boom. You see animals trying out different ways of building bodies, spines everywhere, flaps for swimming, weird filter-feeding arms, stacked feeding appendages. Some combinations worked and eventually evolved into the lineages we recognise today. Others didn't make it past this period. If you only had later fossils, you'd never know how wild the early trial and error phase really was. From a technical angle, the preservation goes down to silly levels. Under microscopes, researchers have found traces of nerve cords, eye structures, and ultra-thin filaments that probably supported gills or soft appendages. In some cases, even the differences between muscle blocks can be seen in the films. That level of fidelity is what lets scientists reconstruct not just the outside silhouette, but also internal anatomy and how these creatures might have moved or fed. The Burgess Shale also turned out not to be a one-off miracle, but the first famous member of a whole class of Burgess Shale-type deposits. Later, similar sites were discovered in China, Zhejiang, Greenland, Sirius Passet, and other places. Each one preserves Cambrian soft-bodied animals in similar detail, but with its own local cast. Put together, they show that these freaky early animals weren't rare local oddities, they were part of global ecosystems. The Burgess Shale just happened to be the first window we opened. Even now, over a century after its discovery, scientists are still reclassifying Burgess animals, reinterpreting their body parts, and occasionally realizing that something everybody thought was one animal is actually two animals squashed together. New techniques like scanning fossils in 3D and mapping chemical signatures keep pulling more information out of those thin black films. It's like the fossils keep respawning with higher resolution every few decades. In the end, the Burgess Shale is legendary because it breaks the usual fossil rule. Instead of a few scattered bones that force you to guess the rest, you get full-body receipts of creatures from a time when complex life was brand new. It turns the Cambrian explosion from a vague concept into something you can almost imagine swimming through. And it proves that sometimes, if conditions are just right, deep time doesn't just save skeletons, it saves whole worlds. Mesopit, fossil animals so real you can see their last snack. If most fossil sites are like blurry black and white photos, Mesopit in Germany is full-color HD. It's an old oil shale quarry near Frankfurt, and about 47 million years ago, it was a deep, still lake in a warm, forested world. Today, that lake floor has turned into one of the most ridiculous fossil treasure troves on Earth. Bats with fur and wing membranes, tiny horses with manes and stomach contents, birds with feather patterns, even insects so crisp you can see their wing veins. It feels less like geology and more like someone pressed pause on an entire rainforest. Back in the Eocene, Messel wasn't a peaceful swimming hole. The lake sat in a volcanic crater basin. At times, gases like carbon dioxide likely built up in the deep water. When the stratified layers mixed, maybe during storms or seasonal turnover, poisonous water and gas could rise to the surface. Animals coming down to drink or falling into the lake could be stunned, drown, and sink into the oxygen-poor depths. Down there, decay slowed to a crawl. Fine mud and organic ooze gently buried the bodies, sealing them off from scavengers and bacteria. That combo, rapid burial, no oxygen, superfine sediment, is the secret behind Messel's insane preservation. Instead of skeletons falling apart and scattering, entire carcasses settled almost intact. Over time, the soft tissues didn't just rot. They were chemically transformed into thin films and infills that still follow the original shapes. When you split the oil shale, you don't just get bones. You get silhouettes of fur, outlines of skin, and sometimes the faint colours and patterns of feathers and scales. Take the famous Messel horses, like Pro-Paleotherium. These were small, dog-sized early horses with multiple toes, not the single hoof we see today. In Messel slabs, you can see their full bodies curled on their sides, limbs tucked, tails and aints ghosting along their backs. Some specimens preserve the gut contents, leaves, fruit or seeds still in the digestive tract, letting scientists see exactly what an Eocene horse was munching before everything went wrong. You don't have to imagine their diet. It's literally fossilized inside them. Then there are the bats. Messel has produced dozens of bat fossils, and they're mind-blowing. The bones of their delicate wings are all there, but so are the wing membranes themselves, the thin skin between the fingers. You can trace the outline of each wing like you're looking at a pressed flower. In some specimens, even tiny claws, fur texture, and internal organ shadows are visible. For a group of animals that almost never fossilize well, Messel turns bats into fully readable documents. Birds from Messel show similar wizard-level preservation. Their feathers don't just show up as vague smudges. Individual barbs and vein structures can sometimes be seen, giving clues to flight style and even colour patterning. Some birds preserve fish inside their stomachs, captured mid-digestion. Others show gizzard stones that helped grind up food. In one famous fossil, a snake swallowed a lizard, and then the snake itself died and fossilized, preserving a full food chain inside a fossil, inside a rock moment. Reptiles and mammals weren't the only ones caught. Messel's lake trapped crocodiles, turtles, rodents, primates, and even weird things that don't neatly match any living group. Early primates, for example, show detailed hands and feet, tails, and sometimes facial outlines, giving real data on how arboreal life and early primate evolution worked in post-dinosaur forests. It's like someone took our vague idea of Eocene jungle and dropped a bunch of perfectly preserved NPC models into it. Even the small stuff is extra. Fish fossils sit in the shale with gill covers, fin rays, and scale patterns all preserved. Insect fossils show wings, legs, and sometimes body hair. There are leaves with intact cuticles, fossilized pollen, and plant remains so fine that researchers can reconstruct the ancient forest composition almost tree by tree. Messel isn't just about charismatic animals. It's an entire ecosystem, from canopy to lake bottom, recorded over millions of years. The chemistry behind all this is complex, but the short version is that Messel's oil shale formed from an organic-rich soup at the lake bottom. Dead plankton, algae, and plant material built up into a thick layer of muck. As it compacted and heated over geological time, it turned into bitumen-rich shale, the same degassing, fine-grained deposition and anoxic water that made that oil source also gave us the fossils. In a way, Messel is a fossil site piggybacking on an ancient energy deposit. What's wild is that Messel came close to being destroyed. In the 20th century, companies used it as an oil shale mine and even considered turning it into a landfill. Only after paleontologists started pulling out world-class fossils did people realize what was at stake. Intense lobbying eventually turned Messel into a UNESCO World Heritage Site, saving the remaining layers from being crushed, burned, or buried under trash. The idea that we almost paved over bats with wing membranes and horses with their last meal still inside them is kind of terrifying. Today, Messel acts like a benchmark for what exceptional preservation really means. When paleontologists talk about other fossil lakes or Lagerstätten, they often compare them to Messel. Is it Messel level good? In many cases, the answer is no. The site sets a high bar especially for combining diversity, quantity, and soft tissue detail in the same place. The bigger payoff is how much behaviour and ecology you can read right off the slabs. You can see who ate whom, who lived in trees, who hunted at night, who swam or glided. You can track climate by plant types and lake chemistry. You can even see weird pathologies and injuries, broken bones that healed, parasites that left marks on organs, diseases that warped skeletons. It's less like a fossil site and more like a morgue from a lost world, with everybody telling a specific story. Strip it down and Messel Pit is one simple thing, a lake that killed things quickly and buried them gently enough to keep the details almost no other place on Earth can preserve. Fur, feathers, skin, guts, and last meals are all still there, pinned in rock, 90% of the way to looking alive. Liaoning's feathered dinosaurs, when fossils kept their coats. If dinosaurs still feel naked in your head, just scaly lizards scaled up, you probably haven't met Liaoning properly. In northeastern China, the early Cretaceous rocks of Liaoning and the broader Jehol group are where the dinosaurs had feathers conversation stopped being theory and became receipts. These lake beds didn't just keep skeletons, they kept full-on outfits, fuzzy coats, flight feathers, colour banding, even tail stripes and camouflage. About 120 to 130 million years ago, this region was a volcanic landscape dotted with lakes, forests, and active ash-spewing volcanoes. When eruptions hit, ash clouds and debris storms suffocated local wildlife and plants. Animals fell into lakes or were buried on the spot, then sank into fine, anoxic mud at the bottom. That cocktail, instant death, superfine sediment, low oxygen, turned the lake bottoms into a prehistoric photocopier, capturing details you almost never see anywhere else. Wikipedia +1. The fossil that really kicked the door open was Sinosauropteryx. At first glance, it's just a small theropod, long tail, sharp teeth, classic little predator vibes. But the slabs from Liaoning show something extra, a halo of filaments running along its back and tail. Not scales, not skin folds, short, hair-like structures that turned out to be primitive feathers, or proto-feathers. They're preserved as dark fuzzy lines following the contour of the body, clear enough that you can see their real structures, not random staining. Later work even showed banding in the tail filaments, which researchers tied to melanosomes, the tiny pigment packages that give colour, suggesting the tail had alternating light and dark rings. Encyclopaedia Britannica +1. That alone would have been huge, but Liaoning didn't stop at small fuzzball dinos. It went full collection drop. There's Caudipteryx, a peacock-sized, short-tailed theropod with big stiff feathers on its arms and tail, classic veined feathers, arranged in a fan at the tail tip. It still has teeth and a more dinosaur-ish body plan, but the feathering looks like something you could see on a modern bird. The fossils show individual feather shafts and barbs fanning out from the arms, turning maybe feathers evolved here into, yeah, they definitely did. American Museum of Natural History +1. Then you've got early birds like Confucius ornis, with fully developed flight feathers and long ornamental tail plumes. Some specimens preserve asymmetrical wing feathers, important for powered flight, plus delicate pair of ribbon-like tail feathers that might have been used for display. Multiple individuals even preserve keratinous beaks instead of toothed jaws, showing a mix of dinosaur heritage and bird upgrades in one animal. In slabs, you can trace wing outlines almost like you're looking at pressed taxidermy. Wikipedia +1. Liaoning also delivered drama with Microraptor, the famous four-winged dinosaur. Its fossils show fully feathered arms and legs, with long flight feathers on both, plus a fan at the tail tip. The preservation is detailed enough to reconstruct entire feather arrays, lengths, layers, and how they overlapped. Later analyses of melanosomes in Microraptor feathers suggested an iridescent, crow-like sheen, meaning this crow-sized, tree-dwelling predator probably shimmered in dark blues and blacks as it glided between trunks. That's not just anatomy, that's whole mood. National Geographic +1. And it wasn't only the small guys. Liaoning is also where Yutyrannus showed up, a tyrannosauroid about the size of a bus with clear filamentous feathers across its body. The fossils preserve long hair-like structures along the neck, arms and tail. That discovery slammed a pretty big hole in the old big theropods were just scaly idea and made it way more plausible that at least some big predators wore partial fuzz, especially in cooler climates. The Times of India +1. The preservation rules here are the same ones powering places like Messel and the Burgess Shale, fine-grained sediment and low oxygen. Liaoning's lakes were calm basins where microscopic volcanic ash and silt settled slowly, blanketing bodies in layers thin enough to capture structures as tiny as feather barbs and melanosomes. Chemical reactions converted soft tissues to films of carbon and iron minerals, but the shapes stayed razor sharp. Under a microscope, you can actually see different melanosome types, rod-shaped for blacks and greys, rounder ones for reds and browns, embedded in the fossil feathers. That's how scientists started reconstructing not just there were feathers, but this species likely had a striped tail, or this one was dark on top, light underneath. Encyclopaedia Britannica +1. Beyond how cool they look, these fossils straight up forced a rewrite of our mental file on what is a dinosaur. Before Liaoning, feathered dinosaurs were mostly a theoretical bridge between classic reptiles and birds. After Liaoning, the bridge turned into a 6-lane highway. It showed that feathers weren't just a late, bird-only thing. They popped up early and widely across theropods, and likely had multiple functions long before flight: insulation, display, camouflage, even brooding eggs. Birds stopped being weird flying reptiles and became exactly what they are: one surviving branch of a much bigger feathered dinosaur family. Liaoning also blurred lines between bird and non-bird, so much that the old category wall basically collapsed. You have animals with long bony tails but full flight feathers. You have short-tailed forms with beaks and perching feet. You have gliders, flappers, runners and climbers, all sharing mixed sets of traits. Instead of a neat ladder from dino to bird, you see a dense bush of experiments. 4 wings here, display tails there, different shoulder setups, different feather spreads. And it's not just about dinosaurs themselves. Because the Johol biota includes plants, insects, fish, mammals and more, you can place these feathered predators and proto-birds inside their actual environment. You see what they might have hunted, what trees they perched in, what lakes they crashed into when volcanic ash storms hit. It's a whole early Cretaceous community with the saturation slider turned up, not just isolated, cool animals. Even now, new species keep getting described from Liaoning and surrounding formations. Every batch of fossils adds another weird combo, a different feather arrangement, a slightly changed wing design, a fresh twist on how early birds and bird-like dinosaurs lived. The fact that so many specimens are nearly complete and articulated, with clear soft tissue outlines, makes this one of the most important fossil regions on the planet, period. Liaoning didn't just prove dinosaurs had feathers. It showed us what those feathers looked like, how they were arranged, and even what colours they probably glowed under Cretaceous sunlight. It took the dinosaurs out of the scaly monster aesthetic and put them back in their real skins. Fluffy, patterned, sometimes iridescent, and way closer to the birds outside your window than the movie monsters most of us grew up with. Dinosaur tail in amber, feathers trapped in tree resin. Most fossils flatten everything. Feathers turn into vague shadows, colours disappear, and anything soft just doesn't make it. That's why the little piece of amber with a dinosaur tail inside it feels almost like cheating. It's not just a fossil, it's a literal chunk of a dinosaur, feathers and all, trapped in ancient tree resin like a paused frame from the Cretaceous. The amber itself is about the size of a large grape, a warm honey colour with a streak of darker material running through it. That streak is the tail, a series of tiny vertebrae in a row, still jointed together, wrapped in soft tissue and fine, branching feathers. Under normal fossil conditions, those vertebrae would be part of a skeleton pressed flat in rock. Here they're three-dimensional, suspended and ridiculously crisp. When you look closely, whether under a microscope or on high-res scans, you can see the individual tail feathers radiating out from the bony core. They're not simple hairs or fuzz. Each feather has a central shaft with barbs branching off, and those barbs split again into tiny barbules, the same layered architecture that lets modern bird feathers zip together. The structure screams dinosaur-bird connection louder than any diagram ever could. What makes it extra wild is that you can also see colour patterns. The feathers in this tail aren't just featureless pale ghosts, they preserve original pigment structures turned into dark and light bands. The outer regions appear darker, likely brown, while the inner parts are paler. It's not full HD colour, but it's enough to tell this animal didn't have a plain, monotone tail. It had patterning, maybe for display, maybe for camouflage. The vertebrae inside the amber tell you this isn't from a bird that got unlucky and crashed into tree resin. The tailbones are long and flexible, not fused into a short piger style like in modern birds. That anatomy fits a small, non-avian theropod, basically a tiny, bird-like dinosaur still rocking the classic long tail, but already fully invested in feathers. You're literally looking at a dinosaur tail mid-evolution, still in dino mode structurally, but covered in bird-style plumage. To get a fossil like this, a very specific chain of chaos had to play out. First, a tree in a Cretaceous forest exuded a thick glob of sticky resin. Somewhere nearby, this small dinosaur scraped past, maybe a predator bite, maybe a branch snag, maybe a fall, and part of its tail ended up torn or trapped. That bit dipped into the resin, which trapped it like flypaper. The resin hardened, sealing the soft tissues off from air, bacteria, and most scavengers. Over time, more resin flowed over the top, encasing the tail deeper. The tree died, fell, and the resin nodules buried in sediment. With pressure and time, the resin polymerized and fossilized, turning into amber. All the while, inside that bubble, the tail's soft tissues slowly dried and chemically altered but didn't rot away, because the resin acted like a natural vacuum-sealed container. That's the real magic of amber. It doesn't preserve things as impressions, it keeps them in 3 dimensions. Insects, plant fragments, strands of hair, and in this case actual bone and feathers, are held in place as if floating in glass. You can rotate the piece and see the tail from different angles. CT scans let scientists digitally peel away layers and explore inside without breaking it, mapping each vertebra and feather in absurd detail. Amber has given us feathers before, individual dinosaur feathers, bird feathers, little clusters stuck in resin. But those are usually detached. You can't say for sure whose body they came from. The tail fossil is different because it keeps the full package, the bone and the plumage together. That's the part that turns "this is probably dinosaur feather" into "this is a dinosaur's feathered tail," end of discussion. It also tells you something about what feathers were doing at this point in evolution. The feathers here don't look optimized for powered flight. They're more like soft, flexible body feathers, good for insulation, display, and maybe some stability and maneuvering, but not the rigid flight feathers you see on the wing of a hawk. That fits the idea that feathers originally evolved for things like warmth and signaling, and only later got recruited for serious flying. Around the tail in the amber, there are other tiny inclusions, plant bits, bubbles, maybe some small arthropods. They're like background props in the scene, telling you this wasn't a lab specimen. It was a chunk of real forest floor. You can almost picture the environment: trees dripping resin, insects buzzing, small feathered dinosaurs weaving through branches, and one unlucky tail tip getting caught and preserved forever. From a research angle, this fossil is like a high-level hack. It lets scientists compare the fine structure of dinosaur feathers directly with modern bird feathers, right down to the size and arrangement of barbules. That helps test hypotheses about how good these feathers were at trapping air, shedding water, or reflecting light. It also shows that complex branching feathers were already widespread among non-avian theropods by the mid-Cretaceous. And then there's the vibe factor. Dinosaurs with feathers used to sound like a weird niche idea. This little amber piece slices through all that. You don't have to imagine a feathered dinosaur. You can hold a literal piece of one in your hand, a small tail, still dressed in its ancient plumage, glowing gold under the light like it never fully left its original world. Microraptor's last meal. A four-winged dinosaur with food still inside. Microraptor on its own would already be wild enough. A crow-sized four-winged dinosaur gliding through early Cretaceous forests with feathers not just on its arms and tail, but on its legs too. The liaoning fossils that preserve it are so detailed you can see the long flight feathers fanned out from all four limbs, turning its whole body into a living kite. But the thing that takes Microraptor from cool to no way this is real is what's sitting inside some of those skeletons. This is one of the rare dinosaurs where we don't have to guess what it ate. Its last meals are still in there. Microraptor lived about 120 million years ago in the same Jahol ecosystem as a lot of the feathered dinosaurs you already met. Volcano-ringed lakes, lush forests, ash falls that turned the bottom of quiet waters into natural scanners. When a Microraptor died and ended up in one of those lakes, its body got wrapped in fine mud that locked in not only the bones and feathers, but also the contents of its chest and belly. Later, as minerals slowly replaced organic material, those last snacks turned into fossil silhouettes inside the ribcage. The first big "okay, that's its dinner" moment came when paleontologists found a Microraptor specimen with the remains of a small bird inside. You can see bones of the prey's wings and legs bunched in the area where the Microraptor's stomach would have been. The orientation and partial digestion show it wasn't some random bones that fell in later. This was food, mid-process. That alone was huge. A four-winged dinosaur that hunted other small, tree-dwelling animals, catching them and swallowing them whole. Then another Microraptor dropped and changed the vibe. This time, the gut held fish bones, clear, identifiable bits of a small, ray-finned fish. Suddenly, Microraptor wasn't just a tree predator. It could swoop down to water and grab aquatic prey too. The legs with long feathers would have made it a powerful glider, able to launch from branches and silently drop down on fish near the surface or on the shore. Being able to say, "This gliding dinosaur ate fish," because the fish is still in there, is the kind of evidence scientists usually only dream about. It didn't stop there. Other Microraptor fossils preserve lizard remains and even small mammal bones inside the body cavity. So across multiple specimens you get 4 different prey types: birds, fish, lizards and mammals. That turns Microraptor from a specialist into a full-on opportunistic hunter. It wasn't locked into one niche. If it could catch it, on a branch, on the ground or in the water, it was on the menu. The preservation is what makes those conclusions rock solid instead of speculation. In many dinosaurs, you'll get scattered bones near the ribs, and people argue forever about whether that's stomach content or just random debris. With Microraptor, the prey bones sit clearly inside the ribcage outline, often encased in a different coloured matrix marking stomach or gut material. The rest of the skeleton is articulated, limbs in life position, tail straight or gently curved, wings spread or folded. That tells you the carcass wasn't ripped apart and moved around much after death. It sank, settled, and got buried quickly. Overlay that with the feather detail and it gets even better. The long asymmetrical feathers on the arms and legs are preserved as dark fibrous impressions fanning off the bones. The tail shows a diamond-shaped fan of feathers at the tip. You can read the whole aerodynamic package in the rock: front wings, hind wings, tail stabilizer. Now, put that together with, "This one had a fish in its gut," and you suddenly have not just a cool silhouette, but a working model of a real animal's lifestyle. A small, agile predator able to glide down from trees, pivot in the air, and grab whatever prey was available. Scientists have used these gut fossils to argue about how Microraptor hunted. The bird and mammal remain support a very arboreal, cat-in-the-trees hunter, pouncing downward on other climbers and flyers. The fish remains suggest a more flexible approach, maybe sitting on low branches over water or hunting along riverbanks and ponds. The lizards add ground or trunk hunting into the mix. Instead of being locked into one type of prey, Microraptor looks like a generalist, using its four-winged setup to exploit a whole 3D environment of trees, air and shoreline. The Johol-style preservation that makes any of this possible is the same one showing us feathers on other dinosaurs, calm lakes, fine sediments, low oxygen and quick burial. What's special with Microraptor is how often those conditions captured an animal so soon after it ate. If a predator dies long after a meal, the bones of the prey can move through the digestive system, dissolve, or pass out. The fact that we see whole skeletons of prey species inside some Microraptors means those individuals died relatively soon after eating. We're catching them in their last few hours, maybe even minutes. From a bigger angle view, Microraptor's menu also feeds back into how we think gliding and flying evolved. If having 4 feathered limbs gave it a serious hunting advantage, more precise control when dropping on prey, more stability in complex forest air, then gliding isn't just a cute side experiment. It's a real ecological strategy that shaped bodies, feathers and behaviour. The gut contents prove that this wasn't a clumsy proto-bird barely surviving. It was a successful, busy predator. So in one small dinosaur, you get an absurdly complete package. Full skeleton, fully feathered wings and tail, preserved posture, and in multiple cases, the last thing it ate locked inside the ribs like a confession. Most fossils can only tell you what an animal could have done. Microraptor goes further and shows you what it actually did, right up until the ash fell and the lake floor turned its final hunt into a permanent record. And if a crow-sized glider can still whisper its final meal across 120 million years, imagine what the fossils of an armored dinosaur mummy might reveal, when even the shape, colour and contents of its stomach are still sitting exactly where they were in life. Scipionyx, the baby dinosaur, with its organs still visible. Most dinosaurs show up as bones. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get a skin impression or a vague outline. Scipionyx is different. This tiny Italian theropod doesn't just give us a skeleton, it shows organs, actual internal organs. Intestines, liver, muscles, maybe even parts of the windpipe, all mapped inside a baby dinosaur that died more than 100 million years ago. The story starts in southern Italy, near the village of Pietraroggia. The rocks there are fine-grained limestones from the early Cretaceous, laid down in a shallow lagoon system dotted with small islands. In the early 1980s, a fossil collector found a small slab with a delicate skeleton on it, and thought it might be some kind of ancient bird. It ended up in a private collection, basically just existing as cool little fossil for years. Only later did paleontologists get a proper look and realise they were staring at one of the most detailed dinosaur fossils anyone had ever seen. The animal itself was a hatchling or very young juvenile, only about 20 to 30 centimetres long from snout to tail tip when it died. In life, full-grown members of its group might have reached around a metre or a bit more. Scipionyx belonged to the general small predator club, related to Compsognathid-style theropods. Think lightweight, long-tailed, two-legged hunter, built for quick movements and snatching small prey. But the exact species identity is kind of background noise compared to what the fossil actually preserves. When you look at the Pietraroggia slab, the first thing you notice is the posture. The little dinosaur lies on its side in a curled pose, head slightly tucked, tail wrapping around. The bones are beautifully articulated, vertebrae in order, ribs in neat arcs, limbs bonded. That alone would make it a nice specimen. But what made paleontologists freak out weren't the bones. It was the extra shadows and streaks inside the ribcage. Running along the belly region are dark, branching and looping shapes that don't match any bones. Those are the fossilized remains of the digestive tract. You can trace sections where the intestine bent and coiled. Near the front, there are denser, more massive patches interpreted as the liver. Higher up, near the neck and chest, faint bands and tubes line up with where the trachea and parts of the respiratory system would have been. In the hind limb region, you see preserved muscle blocks and even tendons. All of that happened because the conditions at Pietraroja were ridiculously specific. The lagoon was a calm, restricted environment with fine carbonate mud settling on the bottom. When this baby dinosaur died, maybe washed into the water, maybe trapped in a small lagoon, its body sank into low oxygen mud. Bacteria started doing their thing, but instead of destroying everything, they drove chemical reactions that caused phosphate minerals to precipitate onto the decaying tissues. Organs that would normally vanish in days became coated and replaced by tiny crystals. The result is a ghostly, mineralized map of soft tissue. Under microscopes and imaging, the detail is wild. Muscle fibers are preserved as parallel streaks. The intestine shows layered walls. Some structures look like the attachments of respiratory muscles, including hints that this dinosaur had a more bird-like breathing system than a reptile-like one. That's important because it feeds into debates about how early dinosaurs powered their metabolism, whether they were sluggish or running hot with high oxygen demands. Scipionics has also given clues about how baby theropods lived. The size and development of the digestive organs suggest it was already capable of handling solid food, not just living on yolk reserves. There are traces of what might be partially digested material in the gut region, hinting that this youngster had eaten shortly before dying. You're basically catching a dinosaur a short time after its last meal, with the internal plumbing mid-use. Because the skeleton is so complete, researchers can combine the soft tissue map with classic bone anatomy. The tail vertebrae show chevron bones and muscle attachment points, while the legs display growth features that confirm the juvenile age. The proportions, relatively large head, short body, and big eyes, judging from the skull openings, make it clear this was very young, possibly still in an early growth stage where certain organs and systems were developing at high speed. The preservation even affects how artists and scientists reconstruct dinosaur bodies in general. Instead of guessing how thick the belly should be, how the muscles bulged, or where exactly the diaphragm-like structures sat, Scipionics provides a reference. It shows that small theropods had pretty deep, complex abdominal cavities packed with organs, not flat, shrink-wrapped torsos. That influences how we imagine everything from posture to breathing to agility. There's also something strangely intimate about this fossil. Bones feel distant and abstract. Inner organs feel personal. Seeing the curled body of a baby dinosaur with its inside still outlined is like walking into a time-frozen autopsy. You're not just learning that dinosaurs had livers and intestines, of course they did. You're seeing how big they were, where they sat, and how they fit into a small, growing body that never got the chance to grow up. The science side keeps evolving as new techniques come online. CT scans, UV light, and chemical mapping all squeeze more data out of the same slab without damaging it. Researchers can test ideas about blood flow, oxygen use, and growth rates using organ size and placement. Scipionics ends up being less just another dinosaur and more a model organism for deep time anatomy, the way lab mice are for modern biology. But even when you put all the analysis aside, the basic fact stays shocking. A tiny predator that died over 100 million years ago in an Italian lagoon is still, in a way, an open book. Its body didn't just leave a skeleton, it left a blueprint of its organs, preserved so clearly that we can still read them today. Psittacosaurus, skin colour patterns, and even the cloaca. Psittacosaurus is one of those dinosaurs that looks pretty basic at first glance. Small, beaked, dog-sized plant eater, kind of like a parrot-faced deer. But the Frankfurt specimen takes it from generic early ceratopsian to this might be the most oversharing dinosaur in history. This fossil doesn't just keep the bones, it keeps almost the whole outer package: full body skin, colour patterns, tail bristles, and even the cloaca, the opening for, well, everything at the back end. This particular fossil was found in the J-hole rocks of northeastern China and later prepped and studied in Germany. It's laid out on its side, legs tucked, tail stretched back. The skeleton alone is great. Skull with its parrot-style beak, long tail, slender forelimbs, chunkier hind limbs. But what jumps out is the halo of soft tissue around it. Instead of bare bone, you see a silhouette of the entire animal, wrapped in preserved skin and soft tissue impressions. The skin isn't just random wrinkles, it preserves actual scale patterns. Across the body, you get small, polygonal scales packed like a mosaic, with slightly larger feature scales scattered through the mix. On the limbs and flanks, these scales form subtle bands and textures. On the tail, things get extra, a row of long, stiff, bristle-like structures along the top near the base. They look a bit like coarse quills or a brush. These tail bristles probably weren't sharp like porcupine quills, but they would have changed the silhouette of the animal, maybe for display, maybe for signalling, maybe both. Then there's the colour story. In this fossil, pigment-bearing structures in the skin, melanosomes, are preserved well enough that researchers could map light and dark areas across the body. When they did that in 3D, they found a classic counter-shading pattern. Darker on top, lighter underneath. The back, head and upper flanks are reconstructed as darker, while the belly and inner legs are paler. That's the same basic strategy used by a lot of modern animals, deer, antelope, some birds and fish, to break up their shape in dappled light. What's sneaky is that the exact transition line between dark and light on Psittacosaurus fits best with a forested, low-light environment. In bright open habitats, animals often have a sharp, high-contrast line. In shadier, cluttered habitats, the shading tends to be more gradual. When scientists modelled how light would fall on a Psittacosaurus-shaped body in different settings, the fossil's actual pattern matched closed forest better than open plain. So this one fossil doesn't just tell you the dinosaur's colour, it hints at the kind of environment it lived in, under trees, not out on bare grasslands. The head and face also show subtle patterning. Dark patches around the eyes could have acted as eye masks, hiding the true shape of the eye and making the animal harder for predators to read. Slight striping or spotting along the flanks would further fragment the outline. Put that together with the tail bristles, and you get an animal that could either disappear among foliage or, when needed, raise its tail and flex those bristles to flash a more dramatic profile, maybe to impress mates or intimidate rivals. Now to the part no one expected to ever see, the cloaca. In this specimen, the region under the tail, between the hind legs, is preserved well enough that you can see the shape and orientation of the cloacal opening. In modern animals, cloacas come in a few different styles. Birds have one type, crocodilians another, lizards and snakes another. Psittacosaurus doesn't match birds exactly. Instead, its cloaca looks more like the crocodile style, a longitudinal slit with surrounding scales arranged in a distinct pattern. That might sound like weirdly specific trivia, but it matters. It tells you that at least some dinosaurs shared more detailed soft tissue traits with crocs than with modern birds, even though birds are their only living dinosaur descendants. It also shows there were specialized scales around that region, forming a sort of frame or patch. Again, something you'd never guess from bones alone. There's even been discussion about whether subtle bulges or shapes in that area could tell male from female, but so far that's still too speculative to call. The forelimbs and hind limbs give more texture to the picture. On the hands and feet, the skin impressions show thickened pads and slightly different scale types across joints, suggesting Psittacosaurus had decent traction and shock absorption when walking or running. Muscles inferred from the skeleton and skin outline show strong hind limbs for quick bursts of speed, with shorter forelimbs used more for balance and maybe manipulating plants rather than fast quadrupedal running. The skin layer around the chest and belly suggests a fairly round, deep torso, built to pack in a big gut for fermenting plant material. Because the whole animal is preserved in such detail, scientists could build a realistic 3D model with actual data instead of guesses. They didn't have to argue over how thick the tail base should be or how deep the chest was. The fossil literally shows the contour. Combine that with colour mapping and you get something very close to a real-world photo of the Psittacosaurus. Shape, scales, patterns and posture all at once. What's quietly powerful about this fossil is how much it shuts down the shrink-wrapped dinosaur trend you see in older art, where skin is painted directly over bone outlines with barely any soft tissue. Psittacosaurus shows a proper meaty animal with muscle, fat and skin thickness that changes around joints and body regions. It looked like a living creature, not a skeleton with cling film over it. And then there's the bigger perspective. One small early ceratopsian from one site just casually gives us full body skin, detailed colour patterns, tail display structures and the shape of its most private anatomy. That's a ridiculous amount of information from a single individual. Borealopelta, the 3D nodosaur mummy. Most dinosaur fossils are like flat blueprints. Borealopelta is a full 3D model someone forgot to turn off. When miners in Alberta, Canada, hit something strange in an oil sands mine in 2011, they thought it was just another rock. What they'd actually uncovered was the front half of a nodosaur, so perfectly preserved, it looks like it laid down yesterday and turned to stone. The armour is still in place. The skin outline is still there. Even the pattern of its camouflage and the plants it ate right before it died are preserved inside. Borealopelta was a tank of an animal, about 5.5 meters long, heavily built, and covered in bony plates and spikes embedded in its skin. It lived around 110 million years ago during the early Cretaceous, in what was then a coastal plain near a shallow inland sea. But nodosaur fossils show scattered armour plates and bones that have shifted out of place, so paleontologists usually have to guess how everything lined up in life. Borealopelta shut that problem down completely. The way it died is a big part of why it looks so good. At some point, this nodosaur probably lived near a river or floodplain. Either it was swept out to sea during a flood, or it died near water and its carcass floated. As gases built up inside the body, it would have bloated and drifted, belly up, into the western interior seaway. Eventually, the gases escaped or the body burst, and the carcass flipped and sank back first into the seafloor mud. Landing on its back in soft sediment did two crucial things. First, it protected the armour and skin on the top of the body from being torn apart by scavengers or currents. Second, it buried that armoured surface quickly in low oxygen mud. The environment at the bottom of that sea was calm and murky, with very little life to chew the carcass to pieces. Over time, minerals seeped into the tissues, turning the skin, armour and even some soft parts into rock, while keeping their shape in 3 dimensions. When the fossil was prepared, what emerged looked like a sculpture. The head and neck are there, shielded by thick tile-like armour plates. The shoulders bear huge curved spikes that flare out to the sides. Down the back, rows of osteoderms, bony armour plates, are still locked in their original positions, not scattered like puzzle pieces. Even the ridges and textures on each plate show up clearly, along with the pebbly, scale-covered skin between them. You're not looking at bare bone, you're looking at a dinosaur still wearing its armour suit. The skin surface is preserved as a thin mineral layer that captures scale shapes and arrangements. These scales are not all identical. Some are larger, knob-like structures surrounded by smaller ones. That patterning gives clues about how light would have hit the body, how the skin flexed, and how tough certain areas were. On the limbs and flanks, the fossil preserves enough contour to show that Borealopelta wasn't a flat block. It was a rounded, muscular animal with a deep chest and solid shoulders. Scientists went a step further and studied the chemistry of the preserved skin to look for pigment structures. Inside the fossilized tissue, they found traces consistent with melanin-bearing bodies that would have given color in life. By mapping where those traces were stronger or weaker, they reconstructed a color pattern. Borealopelta was darker on its back and lighter on its underside. Classic countershading. That's the same strategy many modern animals use to blend into their surroundings and break up their shape for predators. The punchline is almost ironic. This was a multi-ton, heavily armoured herbivore with massive spikes on its shoulders. And it still evolved camouflaged. That suggests the predators in its environment, big theropods, were dangerous enough that even a walking tank wanted help staying hidden. It also tells you something about the light environment. A darker top and lighter belly works best in open sunlit habitats where light from above is strong. So this nodosaur wasn't creeping only in deep forest gloom. It likely moved through more open areas where its outline could be seen from a distance. Inside the ribcage, Borealopelta holds yet another surprise, its last meal. In the region where the stomach would have been, there's a concentrated mass of plant material that preserved better than the rest of the gut. When researchers sliced and examined it, they found bits of ferns, cycads, and other plants, along with charcoal fragments. That means this individual was browsing low plants and likely feeding in an area that had burned recently, gnawing on regrowing vegetation and maybe even swallowing charcoal, which some modern animals do to help with digestion or toxins. The combination of armour in life position, skin, colour patterns and stomach contents makes Borealopelta absurdly informative. Normally, to get this much detail, paleontologists would have to piece together data from many different fossils and modern analogues. Here, one dinosaur does it all. You can see what it looked like, how its armour was arranged, what its general coloration was, roughly what kind of habitat it lived in, and what it was eating in the days before it died. Even the way the fossil is posed tells a little story. The neck is slightly bent, the head angled to one side, limbs folded. It's not the death pose you see when skeletons dry out and ligaments shrink. It's closer to how a heavy body would slump when it hits the bottom and settles into mud. That relaxed, almost natural posture adds to the eerie sense that the animal is just resting rather than gone. Borealopelta also changes how we think about armoured dinosaurs visually. Early art often showed them as dull grey or green, like tanks on legs. The evidence for countershading and possible reddish-brown tones suggests something more like a giant camouflaged boar crossed with a pine cone, an active, visually complex animal, not a slow, moving rock. It pushes reconstructions of other nodosaurs and ankylosaurs toward more realistic, varied colour schemes and textures. Fossils like this are incredibly rare because you need nearly impossible timing. A big animal that dies in the right place, sinks whole, lands in soft sediment, and stays undisturbed long enough to be completely entombed. The chances of that happening and then being exposed millions of years later in exactly the right kind of mine are tiny. That's why Borealopelta feels less like a normal fossil and more like a once-in-many-lifetimes glitch where time preservation got turned up to max. Most dinosaurs show up as puzzles other people already lost most of the pieces to. Borealopelta is one of the freak cases where the box is almost still sealed. The picture on the front is visible, and the last thing it did, browsing plants under a Cretaceous sun, still leaves traces inside its stone-still chest. Dakota and the hadrosaur. Mummies, duckbills with skin and crests. When people say dinosaur mummy, it sounds like a joke. Dinosaurs are supposed to be bare skeletons in dusty museums, not full bodies with skin, muscle outlines, and the literal shape of their hands and feet, still intact. But that's exactly what some hadrosaur fossils give us, especially the ones nicknamed Dakota and its hadrosaur mummy cousins. These aren't wrapped in bandages, but they are so well preserved that you get a disturbingly clear idea of what a duck-billed dinosaur really looked like in life. Dakota turned up in North Dakota's Hell Creek Formation, a place already famous for late Cretaceous rock stars like T-Rex and Triceratops. A teenager out fossil hunting spotted some bones and strange texture on a hillside. When paleontologists moved in and started excavating, they realized they weren't just pulling out isolated bones. Parts of the skeleton were still wrapped in a shriveled skin envelope, like the dinosaur had been vacuum sealed by the Cretaceous. From the neck down, over the shoulders and along the tail, Dakota preserves large sheets of skin impressions. Instead of guessing where the muscles and padding went, you can see the real contour of the body. The tail isn't a thin, bony whip. It's thick, with a deep base and a sturdy profile. The limbs don't look like thin sticks. They're wrapped in skin, showing where the joints bulged and where fleshy pads softened each step. The skin itself is a mosaic of scales. Small, polygonal scales blanket most of the surface, with larger, knob-like feature scales scattered through the mix like raised bumps on a basketball. Along the tail, those scales line up into ridges and subtle rows, giving the tail a textured, almost armoured look, even without bony plates. You start to see why predators might have aimed for softer parts and why artists had been underselling the visual complexity of hadrosaur hides for so long. Dakota wasn't alone in this. Other hadrosaur mummies, including beautifully preserved Edmontosaurus specimens, nicknamed Ed and Edmontosaurus a mummy in museum collections, show similar full-body skin impressions. In some, there's a fleshy crest or ridge running along the back of the neck and spine, a soft tissue frill that doesn't show up on bones at all. Older reconstructions miss that detail completely, drawing duckbills with flat backs and smooth necks. These fossils say nope. Some hadrosaurs carried a low, inflatable-looking ridge, which could have been used for display, species recognition, or visual communication. The hands and feet are another big reveal. Classic dinosaur art often gave hadrosaurs long, finger-like hands and splayed toes. The mummy-grade fossils show something different. On the front limbs, the fingers are bundled together into a fleshy mitten, with a hoof-like outer covering rather than separate, exposed claws. On the hind feet, the toes are also more compact and padded, more like a broad, weight-bearing hoof than a bird-like claw. That changes how we imagine these animals moving. Less dainty, more like heavy, sure-footed grazers that could put serious weight on their limbs without shredding their own feet. How does a dinosaur get preserved like this in the first place? It's a lot of bad luck for the animal and outrageous luck for us. The most likely sequence is that the hadrosaur died in or near a river channel. Instead of being immediately buried, the carcass lay exposed just long enough for skin to dry and tighten, essentially a natural mummification. As gases and fluids drained away, the skin shrank down around the bones, hugging them tightly. Then, a sudden sand-laden flood buried the whole thing fast, entombing the shrunken skin shell in sediment before scavengers and bacteria could finish the job. Millions of years later, that skin-encased skeleton has turned to rock, but the shape of the soft tissue is still there. When preparators carefully remove the surrounding matrix, the skin impressions pop out as raised or recessed textures that trace the original contour. With Dakota and its relatives, the burial was deep enough and stable enough that the skin shell didn't collapse or get torn apart. It stayed wrapped around the bones, giving a 3D surface, not just a flat imprint. Some hadrosaur mummies even preserve hints of what was going on inside. In a few specimens, including the famous Brachylophosaurus leonardo, often mentioned alongside these, the gut region holds plant matter, chewed leaves, twigs and other vegetation, plus the occasional grit or gastroliths used to grind food. That lets scientists check what types of plants were being eaten and how well they were processed, confirming that these animals were serious bulk feeders, constantly shoveling in low-growing vegetation. When you stack all of this together, skin, crest, tail shape, hands and feet, sometimes stomach contents, you stop thinking of hadrosaurs as generic background herbivores. You see them as highly specialized, visually distinctive animals. Their bodies were padded and muscular. Their skin was textured and patterned. Some had soft ridges running down their backs. Their forelimbs ended in hoof-like mitts designed to support weight and maybe help shift between walking on all fours and rearing up to feed. These fossils also silently critique older paleo art. For decades, duckbills were drawn with skinny necks, shrink-wrapped skulls, flat backs, and ballooned, dragging tails. The mummies say the opposite: thick necks, fleshy faces, subtle crests, deep chests, high tails, and limbs with real bulk. They push reconstructions toward animals that look more like a mashup of a hippo, a moose, and an iguana than a giant lizard. And there's one more layer: the emotional hit of seeing a dinosaur that intact. A skeleton feels distant. A mummy, like Dakota, feels like you're looking at someone who just lay down in the mud and never got back up. Muscle lines, skin folds, and the curve of the shoulders are all still there. It's unnerving in the best way because it strips away the abstraction and forces you to process that this was a living creature with a full, detailed outer life. Most fossils can only hint at those details. The hadrosaur mummies shout them. Baby Yingliang, an embryo curled up like a modern chick. Most dinosaur eggs are like closed laptops. You know there's hardware inside, but you can't see the screen. Baby Yingliang is what happens when the screen gets frozen mid-frame. It's an oviraptorosaur embryo preserved inside its egg in such ridiculous detail that you can see the posture, the bones, and even how it was preparing to hatch, using the same tucking move that modern bird chicks use today. The egg itself was part of a batch collected in southern China years ago, then stored in the collection of Yingliang Stone Nature History Museum. For a while, it sat as cool egg, not sure what's inside. Only when someone noticed tiny bones exposed on the broken side did it become clear that this wasn't just shell. A CT scan and careful prep revealed almost a full skeleton folded inside, still in life position. Oviraptorosaurs were beaked, often crested theropods, mostly omnivores or herbivores, with parrot-like skulls and birdish bodies. Adult skeletons are cool, but this embryo is next level because it shows one before the first breath, not after a lifetime of growth. The embryo is curled spine to shell, with its head tucked toward its chest, legs folded along the body, and the back curved around the inside of the egg like a question mark. The key detail is the head and neck pose. In modern bird embryos, the neck gradually bends so the head slides under one wing, with the beak aimed toward the air cell at the blunt end of the egg. That tucking posture is critical. It lets chicks brace and rotate as they chip their way out. If tucking goes wrong, many don't hatch. In baby Yingliang, the neck is wrapped along the curve of the body and the head snuggles toward the blunt end in a very similar configuration. That's the part that made scientists stop and go, okay, this isn't a coincidence. It suggests that complex pre-hatching behavior, coordinated timed movements of the embryo in the shell, evolved before true birds, inside non-avian dinosaurs like oviraptorosaurs. The whole tuck then hatch routine isn't a late bird invention, it's an old dinosaur trick. The preservation lets you see more than just the pose. The skull shows the short beaked snout of an oviraptorosaur, with big eye sockets hinting at a large-brained, visually oriented animal, even at this stage. The tiny vertebrae of the neck stack in a neat curve. The limbs are there too, forelimbs folded up, hind limbs bent so the knees tuck toward the chest. Nothing is disarticulated or scattered. That tight articulation proves the chick didn't slosh around after death. It died and fossilized basically where it lay. The egg's rock matrix is fine-grained, part of the same style of sediments that turned so many Jehol area fossils into time capsules. The embryo was rapidly buried, either while the egg was still in a nest or after being washed a short distance, and ended up in an environment with low oxygen and slow decay. Over time, minerals seeped into the tiny bones, preserving even delicate elements like ribs, toes, and vertebral arches without crushing them. CT scanning is where this fossil really flexes. Instead of hacking the egg open and risking damage, researchers used high-resolution scans to build a digital 3D model of every bone and the surrounding shell. That means they could rotate the embryo virtually, test different reconstructions of neck and limb positions, and compare it with both modern bird embryos and other dinosaur eggs that preserve fragmentary embryos. Comparison showed that baby Yingliang is more curled and tucked than many earlier known dinosaur embryos, which often look more loosely coiled or less ready to hatch. This suggests that, at least in Oviraptorosaurs, the full bird-like tucking sequence was already in play. Early stage positions, mid-stage positions, and final pre-hatching posture all echoing the choreography seen in living chicks. The shell itself adds context. Oviraptorosaur eggs are usually elongated, with a pointed and a blunt end, often laid in circular clutches with pairs arranged neatly. Adults have been found sitting on these clutches, fossilized in brooding positions, arms spread over the eggs like giant feathered chickens. Baby Yingliang fits into that picture as the missing inside the egg scene, while the parent sat up top, warming and guarding the clutch. This embryo was quietly shifting into its final hatch pose below. You can also tell that the embryo was close to hatching when it died. The skeleton is well ossified for its size. Bones are formed and distinct, not faint cartilage shadows. In modern birds, that level of development usually comes late in incubation, just before emergence. So this isn't a very early embryo. It's one that was likely days or hours away from breaking the shell, frozen just shy of its debut. That timing adds an emotional sting. This wasn't a random yolk with a few cells. It was a nearly finished chick that never got the chance to try the world. You're looking at a paused birthday that never happened, and yet the pose and structure still managed to convey crucial evolutionary information down the line. What baby Yingliang really does is lock in the continuity between non-avian dinosaurs and birds on a behavioural level. Bones already told us they shared anatomy. Feathers told us they shared external hardware. But an embryo using essentially the same hatch prep posture as a modern chick says they shared internal programming too. The neuromuscular routines, the instincts coded into the brain and spine, were already there. The fossil also acts as a reality check for how we imagine dinosaur reproduction. Instead of vague eggs in a nest, you can now picture specific steps: parents arranging eggs, sitting on them, embryos inside gradually curling, tucking and bracing for the hatch. That's not a reptilian leave the eggs and go strategy. It's closer to the kind of care and complexity we associate with birds. And all of that lives inside one egg, in one rock, that easily could have been tossed aside as just another shell. Jeholopterus, a pterosaur with wings, fur, and soft tissue. If you only know pterosaurs from old-school art, you probably picture skinny reptiles with bat wings and bare skin. Jeholopterus rolls up from the Jurassic and just deletes that stereotype. This tiny pterosaur, preserved in the Jehol deposits of northeastern China, keeps not only its bones, but its wing membranes, flight muscles, and a full coat of fuzz-like filaments. It looks less like a naked dragon and more like a flying gremlin in a furry wingsuit. Jahalopterus lived about 160 million years ago, gliding over lakes and forests in what's now Liaoning. The fossil slabs that preserve it are the same style of fine ash and mud layers that kept all those feathered dinosaurs so crisp. When this little flyer died and landed in a lake, it was quickly buried in fine sediment under low oxygen conditions. Over time, the soft tissues didn't get stripped away. They got flattened and mineralized as thin films that still follow the original shapes. The skeleton itself is classic small pterosaur, a lightly built skull with a short, blunt snout and big eye sockets, a long neck, a compact body, and elongated forelimbs with one crazy long fourth finger that supports the wing membrane. The hind limbs are strong but not huge, hinting that this animal spent a lot of time airborne or clinging to tree trunks rather than stomping around on the ground. What makes Jahalopterus famous is everything between the bones. Around the body and limbs, you see a dense halo of pycnofibers, hair-like filaments that are the pterosaur version of fur. They cover the head, neck, torso, and parts of the limbs, forming a fuzzy outline instead of a clean reptile silhouette. Some filaments look simple and hair-like, others branch, looking suspiciously like the protofeather structures we see in some dinosaurs. That's a whole debate on its own, whether these filaments and dinosaur feathers share a deep common origin. The wing membranes are preserved as darker, sheet-like areas stretching from the long fourth finger back toward the body and legs. You can trace the shape of the wing, not just guess it. In Jahalopterus, the membrane reaches down toward the ankle region, forming a wide, almost triangular surface. Within that membrane, fine internal fibers, actinofibrils, show up as parallel lines under magnification. Those fibers would have stiffened and shaped the wing, helping it hold a stable airfoil and fine-tune its flex in flight. Close to the shoulder and chest, there are outlines of soft tissue that match the pectoral and flight muscles. This isn't just, we know there were muscles because bones exist. You can literally see where the bulk of muscle mass sat, how it wrapped around the shoulder, and how thick it was. That's crucial for estimating how powerful Jahalopterus was in the air. This wasn't a weak glider, barely hanging on. The muscle layout points to a capable, active flyer. The fuzz coating isn't just for aesthetics. A dense pycnofiber coat screams warm-blooded metabolism. Insulation only matters if you're generating enough internal heat to keep. Combined with strong flight muscles and big eyes, Jahalopterus looks like a high-energy animal, maybe crepuscular or nocturnal, zipping between trees in dim light, chasing insects or small vertebrates. The fuzz would have smoothed airflow over the body and helped with thermoregulation, much like fur on bats and feathers on birds. Some reconstructions have had fun with its head. The skull proportions, plus the fuzz, give it a bit of a short-faced, big-eyed gremlin vibe. Add in the flexible, well-supported wings, and you can imagine it clinging to tree bark, then launching out with a quick push and flapping into a powered glide. The preserved membranes show enough surface area for controlled flight rather than just chaotic flapping. Jahalopterus also feeds into a bigger story about pterosaur diversity. For a long time, they got flattened into one mental model: big, bald, reptilian hang gliders. Fossils like this show there were small, fuzzy, forest-adapted species with fine-tuned wings and warm-blooded physiology. They weren't just weird side characters in the sky, they were filling specific ecological roles long before birds took over most of those niches. The soft tissue preservation also lets scientists test aerodynamic models. With actual membrane outlines and internal fiber orientation, you can plug realistic wing shapes into simulations instead of guessing span and camber. That helps answer questions like, how fast could Jahalopterus turn? Was it better at soaring, flapping, or short agile bursts? Every preserved fibre tightens the limits on what was physically possible. And then there's that branching filament drama. Some of the pycnofibers on Geholopterus and other Gehol pterosaurs show splits and side branches, more complex than simple, single hairs. Those patterns echo the branching stages in some feather evolution models, which has led to the spicy idea that pterosaur fur and dinosaur bird feathers may share an ancient origin, rather than being completely separate inventions. Not everyone agrees, but Geholopterus is one of the key fossils in that argument. All of this from an animal that could fit in your arms, preserved on a couple of slabs that easily could have been written off as small, random pterosaur. Instead, you've got a full flight rig, a full insulation system, and enough anatomical detail to redraw how entire groups of flying reptiles are imagined. Most fossils let you sketch an outline and fill the rest with educated guesses. Geholopterus does the reverse. It hands you the shapes of wings, muscles, and fur first, then dares you to explain how such a tiny Jurassic flyer lived in that body. And if a palm-sized pterosaur can keep its whole flight suit intact for 160 million years, things get even more surreal when you jump forward in time to baby mammoths pulled out of the ice, with eyelashes, stomach contents, and even bits of brain still in place. Baby mammoth mummies, Liuba, Yucca, Yana, and friends. If any fossils feel like someone hit copy-paste on a living animal, it's the baby mammoth mummies. These aren't just skeletons, they're tiny elephants from the Ice Age, with skin, hair, ears, eyelashes, guts, sometimes brains and milk still inside them, pulled out of frozen ground after tens of thousands of years, like nature's own time capsules. The most famous is Liuba. She was found in 2007 by a reindeer herder on the Yamal Peninsula in Russia, half buried in riverbank mud. At first glance, she doesn't look like a fossil at all. She looks like a sleeping calf. Greyish skin, little trunk, folded ears, even whiskers and wisps of hair. Tests showed she died about 42,000 years ago, at roughly 1 month old. Inside her stomach and lungs, scientists found fine silt and clay. That suggests she probably suffocated after getting stuck in mud or a bog, inhaling water and sediment as she struggled. Because she froze so quickly and stayed locked in permafrost, decay almost stopped. When researchers CT scanned her, they saw internal organs still in place: heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, the whole layout. Even the tiny milk tusks and developing permanent tusks were still there. Chemical analysis of her fat and bone gave clues to her growth and diet. She'd been drinking rich milk and probably nibbling a bit of soft vegetation, just like a modern baby elephant transitioning to solid food. Yucca, another young woolly mammoth from Siberia, shows a different side of this deep freeze magic. She was a bit older when she died, maybe 6 to 8 years old, and her carcass was so fresh looking that when scientists sliced into the muscle, it still had a pinkish colour. In some spots, blood vessels retained remnants of blood. Under the microscope, individual red blood cells could be seen, and soft tissues like ligaments, skin and fat were recognisable. If you didn't know the date, you could mistake close-up photos for a recently dead elephant. Yucca's body also showed signs that something dramatic happened to her. There were strange injuries and missing pieces that might point to scavenging by Ice Age predators or even early humans. Marks on the carcass have been interpreted by some researchers as possible cut marks or evidence of humans harvesting meat or ivory, though that's still debated. Either way, her body records both her life and what happened to her after death, natural or otherwise. Then there's Yana, a pair of 28,000-year-old baby mammoth skeletons found in northeastern Siberia near the Yana River. They're not as fully soft tissue preserved as Liuba, but they still carry skin, hair fragments, and delicate bones in place. Together with other calf finds like Dima, discovered in the 1970s, They let scientists see different stages of mammoth childhood: newborns, a few months old, toddlers, juveniles. You can literally line them up like a growth chart. Permafrost is the cheat code behind all of this. When an animal dies in a cold, wet environment and freezes fast enough, bacteria and fungi barely get a chance to start breaking it down. Ice crystals lock water inside tissues, and the ground above often blocks scavengers. Over thousands of years, the upper layers of soil might thaw and refreeze with the seasons, but deeper layers stay permanently frozen. As long as the carcass stays in that frozen zone, it's stuck in a low-temperature deep freeze where time runs at 1,000th speed. That kind of preservation doesn't just keep organs, it keeps molecules. From mammoth mummies, scientists have extracted high-quality DNA, enough to assemble near-complete genomes and compare them to modern elephants. That's where a lot of the "bring back the mammoth de-extinction" talk comes from. Recently, researchers even managed to sequence bits of ancient RNA and proteins from mammoth tissues, molecules that record which genes were active in certain cells when the animal was alive. That's like finding not just the hardware and the code, but also a few running processes frozen mid-task. Hair is another gold mine. Mammoth fur from these mummies still shows colour banding and structure under a microscope. Some hairs are reddish-brown, others darker, giving clues to coat colour and maybe seasonal changes. The density and layering of the fur, plus the thickness of the skin and fat, tell you how well insulated they were, and how cold their world could get while they still walked around comfortably. The stomach and intestines sometimes preserve bits of the last meal: grasses, sedges, herbs, and woody fragments. These plant remains can be identified and dated, helping reconstruct the exact kind of steppe tundra vegetation mammoths grazed on. Pollen grains and tiny seeds stuck in fur or gut contents add even more detail. What was blooming, what was being eaten, what the climate was like in the final days. Some calves even show microscopic wear patterns on their emerging tusks. And teeth, matching the gritty, frozen soils and tough plants they had to deal with. There's also a quiet, emotional weight to these fossils. They're babies. You see the soft trunk, the folded ears, the closed eyes, frozen in poses that look like they might wake up if you nudged them. Many likely died in accidents, falling into bogs, rivers, or thaw pits. A few may have been caught in sudden floods or collapses of ice. Their deaths are small, local tragedies that ended up preserving some of the clearest snapshots of Ice Age life anyone has ever seen. At the same time, mammoth mummies are a bit of a warning. They only come out of the ground when permafrost thaws or erodes. As Arctic regions warm and melt, more remains are appearing, sometimes in great shape, sometimes falling apart as soon as they're exposed. There's a rush to document and study them before modern decay finishes what the Ice Age paused. Laetoli footprints, hominins caught mid-walk. Most fossils show you what something was. The Laetoli footprints show you what someone was doing. No bones, no skulls, just a trail of bare footprints across volcanic ash in Tanzania, left by early human relatives 3.6 million years ago. So crisp you can measure their stride like they just walked through wet cement. Back in the 1970s, Mary Leakey's team was working in Laetoli, a dusty region south of Olduvai Gorge. The rocks there record a time when East Africa was a mix of woodland and open grass patches, with volcanoes rumbling in the background. One day, a thin layer of ash fell from one of those volcanoes, coating the ground in a soft, powdery blanket. Soon after, rain turned that ash into a sticky, mud-like paste, perfect for holding impressions. Across that fresh surface, animals walked. You can still see their tracks today: antelopes, rhinos, birds, and then the weird ones. A set of prints that didn't match hooves or paws. They had a heel, an arch, and 5 toes. They looked human. Except they were more than 3 million years old, from a time when Homo sapiens didn't exist yet. The famous trail, called Site AG, stretches for about 27 metres. In it, at least 2 and probably 3 hominins walked in the same direction. The largest set of footprints belongs to a taller individual, the smaller to someone shorter, and there may be a third, tiniest trackway partly overlapping the big one, often interpreted as a child stepping in the prints of an adult. It's one of the most quietly powerful images in prehistory. An adult and youngster walking side by side over damp ash, leaving a record no one intended. What makes the Laetoli prints legendary is how well they kept the details of bipedal walking. Each step shows a clear heel strike, a roll through the midfoot, and a push-off from the big toe. There's no sign of knuckle walking, no handprints, no sideways splay that you'd expect from a chimp. The big toe is in line with the others, not sticking out like a thumb. The arches are visible as shallow curves where the midfoot didn't press as deeply into the soft ash. Those small details matter a lot. They tell you that by 3.6 million years ago, some hominins, likely Australopithecus afarensis, the species that includes the famous Lucy, weren't just experimenting with upright walking. They were already walking in a way that looks surprisingly close to ours. Not perfect, not identical, but clearly habitual bipeds with feet retooled for long distances on the ground instead of gripping branches. The preservation window here was ridiculously tight. After the ash fell and turned to sludge, the hominins and other animals walked across it. The sun came back out. The surface dried and hardened, and more ash and sediment slowly buried the layer. If heavy rain had pounded it too much, the prints would have blurred. If winds had stripped it before burial, they'd be gone. Instead, the layer was sealed under other deposits and sat there, hidden, until erosion and a bit of luck brought it back to the surface for humans to find. When Leakey's team realised what they were looking at, they had to move carefully. The prints weren't hard footprints in stone yet. They were fragile impressions in consolidated ash. The team used fine tools and plaster casts to capture the trackway before weather or trampling could erase it. To this day, many of the original prints are reburied for protection, and scientists rely on casts, moulds, and 3D scans to study them without wearing them out. Later work measured the depth and shape of each print in detail. By looking at how the ground was displaced under the heel and toes, researchers reconstructed how weight shifted during each step. That let them estimate things like walking speed, stride length, and body height for the track makers. The tall individual may have been around 1.3 to 1.5 metres. The shorter, possibly under 1.2. They weren't giants, more like small, lightly built people. Laetoli also isn't just one set of hominin tracks. Other nearby sites preserve additional footprints, including some odd, more divergent ones that kicked off debates about how many different hominins were around and how varied their gaits might have been. But the Site G trail remains the most iconic because of its length and clarity, and because it so plainly screams, "These are feet built for walking upright." What's maybe most striking is how personal the whole thing feels. Fossil skulls are important, but they're abstract. Footprints are automatic. Everybody knows what it feels like to walk across damp ground and look back at their prints. At Laetoli, you can stand where those early hominins did and see the path they took, step by step, like a freeze-framed family walk across an ancient savanna. Scientifically, the trackway helped anchor ideas about when and how bipedalism evolved. Before Laetoli, a lot of reconstructions imagined early hominins as halfway creatures, still shaky on 2 legs, maybe dropping to all fours often. The footprints said otherwise. By this stage, at least in this lineage, walking on 2 feet was the default, not a stunt. Pregnant ichthyosaurs, Jurassic marine reptiles with babies inside. If you've ever seen a dolphin skeleton, you already have the basic outline of an ichthyosaur. These marine reptiles weren't dinosaurs. They were ocean specialists that turned into streamlined, fish-shaped torpedoes long before whales existed. What makes some ichthyosaur fossils unreal is that they didn't die alone. They died with their babies still inside them, and sometimes literally in the process of being born. The classic examples come from Jurassic rocks in Europe, especially Germany and England. Species like Stenopterygius show up in fine-grained black shales that formed on the bottom of calm, oxygen-poor seas. Those seas were great at killing and terrible at recycling, which is exactly what you want if you're hoping to preserve delicate things like embryos. When an ichthyosaur died and sank, its body could rest on the seafloor without being torn apart by scavengers or bacteria, letting even tiny bones make the jump into stone. A pregnant Stenopterygius fossil looks almost too perfect. The adult skeleton is laid out in side view, long, pointed snout, big orbit for the eye where a bony sclerotic ring sits, flexible spine curving back into a powerful tail with a downward kink where the tail fin would have been. Along the ribs, inside the body cavity, you see miniature versions of the same thing. Tiny skulls, tiny spines, tiny rib cages, multiple embryos arranged in a line, all pointing the same direction, like a row of little submarines parked inside a hangar. In some specimens, the level of detail is ridiculous. You can count individual vertebrae in the embryos. Their flippers, actually modified limbs, show all the tiny finger bones packed into paddle shapes. In a few fossils, you can even tell which way the babies were oriented. Most of them are positioned tail first, which matches how modern dolphins and whales give birth. Tail first births help prevent drowning because the head and blowhole come out last, giving the calf its first real contact with open water and air in the safest order. One famous ichthyosaur fossil shows the drama mid-scene. Part of a baby is still emerging from the mother's pelvic region, halfway between inside and outside. The rest of the litter remains inside the rib cage. It's a frozen snapshot of labour from 180 million years ago. That single image is enough to crush the old idea that these were egg layers like many reptiles today. Ichthyosaurs were doing full-on live birth in the water, just like modern marine mammals. The rock around these skeletons tells you why the moment froze so cleanly. These shales formed in deep or restricted marine basins where the bottom water was low in oxygen and often loaded with fine mud. An animal that sank there could end up in an almost poisonously still zone where the sediment slowly buried it. As the flesh decayed, the bones settled into the mud and stayed articulated. Gas buildup sometimes made carcasses bloat and burst, but when conditions were just right, even the embryos stayed in place. Ichthyosaur pregnancies weren't small affairs. Some adults carry 3 or 4 embryos, others show more. That suggests they were fairly prolific, having litters rather than single offspring. Combine that with live birth and a streamlined, high-speed body plan, and you get a picture of animals that were much closer in lifestyle to dolphins than to lizards. Fast hunters, warm-bodied, with babies born ready to swim. Soft tissue preservation sometimes pushes it further. In certain Jurassic sites, you can see the outline of the ichthyosaur's body beyond the bones. The torso isn't a skinny tube, it's a deep, muscular barrel. The tail doesn't end in a point. The kinked vertebrae plus the outline show a proper crescent-shaped tail fin. The embryos sit in that barrel region, with the ribs framing them like the bars of a cage. You're not just seeing skeletons, you're seeing whole bodies with babies positioned exactly where they were in life. These maternity fossils also tell you something about how committed ichthyosaurs were to the water. Turtles can crawl onto land to lay eggs. Crocodiles nest on riverbanks. Ichthyosaur anatomy: flippers instead of hands, stiffened spine, powerful tail, pretty much locks them into the sea. Live birth becomes the logical solution. The fact that it's preserved so clearly hints that this strategy had been in place for a long time by the time these individuals died. Scientists can also read timing from these fossils. Embryos near the end of development have well-ossified bones, clear, solid skeletons. Earlier stage embryos are more faint, with some bones still cartilaginous or incomplete. By comparing different pregnant females, researchers can sketch out growth stages in the womb, figuring out how long gestation might have lasted, how big the babies were at birth, and how many the mothers could safely carry. In a few cases, the embryos look disturbed, scattered, partially outside the body, or displaced. That's where interpretation gets tricky. Did the female die mid-birth, causing the babies to be caught halfway? Did gases or pressure after death push embryos out through body openings? Or did scavengers disturb the carcass just enough to move things around before burial? Each specimen becomes its own little crime scene, with the positions of tiny skulls and spines as clues. What's easy to forget is how unlikely this kind of preservation is. For a pregnant ichthyosaur to become a fossil, it had to die at the right time in gestation, in the right place in the water column, sink to the right kind of bottom, and get buried quickly and gently. Most pregnancies in deep time didn't end that way. That's why each one of these fossils feels so unreal. Out of millions of births across millions of years, a handful got captured, complete with mothers and babies in enough detail that we can still count the little skeletons inside. So in one slab of shale, you get a full story. A powerful predator shaped like a reptilian dolphin, carrying multiple young, giving birth tail first in a Jurassic sea, and then sinking into mud before anything could tear the scene apart. It's proof that some fossils don't just show a species, they catch a moment of life, and sometimes the exact moment it ends. Burgess-style sites. Beyond Burgess, Cambrian soft-body time capsules. The Burgess shale's femur became famous because it looks like a glitch in fossil rules. Soft, squishy animals that shouldn't fossilize. Did. But the wild part is that Burgess isn't some one-off miracle. Earth repeated that trick in several places, on different continents at slightly different times. Chengjiang in China, Sirius Passet in Greenland, Emu Bay in Australia and others, are all Burgess-style sites. Cambrian rock layers that grabbed whole ecosystems, soft parts and all, and pinned them down like pressed stickers from the very dawn of complex animal life. Start with Chengjiang. It's older than Burgess by about 10 million years, forming around 518 million years ago in what's now Yunnan, southern China. Back then, it was a shallow sea basin with fine mud settling on the bottom. Volcanic ash falls, underwater landslides, and low oxygen pockets combined to bury entire communities in thin sheets of sediment. The result? Flattened fossils so detailed you can see tentacles, antennae, gills, guts, and sometimes even eye structures. Chengjiang's cast is stacked. You get classic weirdos like five-eyed Opabinia-style forms and spiny walking nightmares, similar to Halicygenia, but also some of the earliest chordates and vertebrate cousins. There are small eel-like animals with a notochord, a stiff rod running along the back, myomas, muscle blocks, and hints of gill structures. The kind of features that tie directly into the line that eventually leads to fish, and way down the road, things like us. If Burgess shows the Cambrian explosion in full bloom, Chengjiang is the earlier stage where some of the key body plans are just starting to appear, still in beta. Up near the ancient polar circle, Sirius Passet in northern Greenland gives another angle. These rocks are also Cambrian, buried under what's now brutal Arctic conditions. When they formed, though, this area was a cold, marine environment near the edge of an early ocean. The preservation there is darker and sometimes rougher than Burgess or Chengjiang, but it still locks in soft-bodied worms, arthropods, and oddball predators. The fossils are often preserved as black films of carbon on slate, like silhouetted cutouts, with enough detail to trace legs, antennae, and sometimes digestive systems. Sirius Passet's fauna feels a little grimmer, more stripped back than the riot of forms in Burgess or Chengjiang. You see elongated worms, slug-like grazers, arthropods with spiky armour and big grasping appendages. It's like someone turned the saturation down but left the weirdness intact. Because it formed in what was then high-latitude waters, it also suggests that these early animal communities weren't just a tropical experiment. The Cambrian explosion was global. Even near the poles, ecosystems had already filled up with predators, scavengers, and soft-bodied everything. Then there's Emu Bay Shale on Kangaroo Island in Australia. It came slightly later than Burgess, but it does the same trick with its own flavour. One of its specialties is eyes, insanely good eyes. Fossils of trilobites and other arthropods from Emu Bay preserve compound eyes with hundreds of individual lenses, letting researchers count facets and estimate how sharp their vision was. You also get the usual Cambrian cast, arthropods with barbed limbs, soft-bodied worms and early filter feeders, all flattened but still legible enough to study how their bodies were wired. What ties all these sites together is the basic recipe. You need fine sediment, mud or volcanic ash ground down to tiny grains, settling in calm water. You need a lack of oxygen on the seafloor, so scavengers and bacteria can't rip everything apart. You need periodic rapid burial events, mudslides, storm deposits, ash falls that suddenly dump a new layer on top of living communities. And you need just the right kind of early diagenesis, where minerals infiltrate and coat tissues instead of destroying them outright. When that works, you get Lagerstätten, the German word paleontologists use for storage sites, places where the fossil record goes from low-res to 4K. Instead of a handful of shells and little bits of trilobite exoskeleton, you get full food webs in a single slice. Predators, prey, scavengers, grazers, plankton, and all the weird in-between forms that usually never show up. Guts appear as darker streaks inside bodies. Delicate gill fronds and feeding appendages hang off heads. Muscle bundles show up as striated bands. Even tiny sensory spines and hair-like structures can be preserved as fine, carbon-rich lines. The global spread of these Burgess-style sites also answers a big question. Was the Cambrian explosion a real biological event or a fossilization fluke? If only Burgess existed, you could argue that global life was always complex, and only one weird Canadian basin just happened to preserve it. But Chengjiang, Sirius Passet, Emu Bay, and other similar deposits in Utah, Spain, and beyond all record the same thing at about the same broad window in time. A sudden bloom of complex, multi-limbed, multi-sensory animals with specialized body parts. Each site has its own local cast and vibe, but the deeper story matches. Before the Cambrian, fossils are mostly simple, microbial mats, single-celled life, a few strange ediacaran forms that don't fit modern phyla well. As you hit these soft-body time capsules in the early Cambrian, the fossil record explodes with recognizable ancestors of arthropods, chordates, echinoderms, mollusks, and a swarm of problematic creatures that may represent body plans that simply didn't make it long-term. Another thing these sites quietly wreck is the idea that early animals were small, simple, and fragile, slowly building up complexity over hundreds of millions of years. The Burgess-type deposits show that as soon as complex animals appear in the record, many are already heavily armed and weirdly over-engineered. You have apex predators like Anomalocaris with camera-like eyes and grasping front limbs coexisting with buried filter feeders, burrowing worms, armoured trilobites, and delicate swimming forms. It's a full, messy ecosystem from the jump, not a slow, neat ladder. For paleontologists, these places end up functioning like multiple camera angles on the same chaotic event. Burgess shows a deeper, offshore slope. Chengjiang gives a shallower, near-shore perspective that's a bit earlier in time. Sirius Passet captures high-latitude seas. Emu Bay adds details from a different continental edge. Stitch them together, and you get a panorama of the Cambrian oceans that's way richer than any single site could provide. And the strangest thought of all is that we probably haven't found every Burgess-style site yet. Cambrian rocks ring the globe, many still barely explored. Somewhere under a desert, glacier or forest, there might be another thin, dark layer of mudstone that holds a whole alien reef system pressed into it, waiting to prove that the weirdest parts of deep time still haven't all been dug up. If this deep time capsule tour blew your mind, hit like so more people actually see how insane the fossil record really is. Subscribe if you want more science that feels fake but isn't. And when you're done here, keep the rabbit hole going by clicking on the next video waiting for you on screen.